UFC 297 betting and DraftKings show. We have 12 fights this Saturday, 2 title fights on the line. I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. And we're going to get things started in the flyweight division as Malcolm Gordon comes in as a minus 166 favorite. The comeback on Jimmy the Brick Flick is plus 140. And this is one that I think a lot of people are going to be split on because there's just so many red flags on both sides. But honestly, I think the market is much lower on Jimmy Flick than I am in this type of matchup. And we'll get into why. For starters, Malcolm Gordon is arguably just as flaky as a guy like Jimmy Flick. That's the number one reason why people don't trust Jimmy Flick, is because he has no durability. He's got knocked out 6 times in his career, and after retiring after his UFC debut, he came back after a couple years, got knocked out instantly in basically both of those fights. So I understand why the confidence isn't super high right now on Jimmy Flick. But what you need to understand is Flick is a guy who, when he's not at risk of being knocked out on the feet, he is a very dangerous fighter. He's a very slick submission grappler, holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's also a solid wrestler as well. That's one thing that I think is being underrated about him in this type of matchup, is that he's got a very strong double leg, good timing on his entries as well. I expect him to be the better wrestler in this matchup. I expect him to be able to land takedowns. But regardless, I just think both of these guys are going to want to grapple. We're going to see a ton of grappling exchanges here, and I favor Jimmy Flick as the better submission grappler. Malcolm Gordon, while he is the better striker, I just don't expect this fight to play out much on the feet, because Malcolm Gordon wants to grapple as well. He wants to get in the clinch, peel you to the ground. He's very sloppy when he does that, and he's been submitted twice in his career. And I talked about the durability of Jimmy Flick. Gordon's been knocked out 5 times in his career as well. He's been hurt to the body multiple times. So I think Gordon is basically as big of a liability, if not more, than Jimmy Flick. And I just trust Jimmy Flick to have multiple advantages with the wrestling and the grappling. I think he could pull off an early submission here. We're going Jimmy Flick by submission. That's the official pick. And this is a great fight to target right off the bat on DraftKings. Next fight up, we have Jasmine Jasudavicius, a minus 395 favorite. The comeback on Priscilla Cachoeira is plus 310. And Jasudavicius is the biggest betting favorite on the card. She's the most expensive fighter on DraftKings at 9,500. So that's going to be a key decision point, is if you want to pay all the way up. As we saw last week, Jean Silva did make the optimal lineup on DraftKings, even as the most expensive fighter. Jasmine Jasudavicius, much different fighting style. We see a lot of her fights end up going the full 15 minutes. So the question is, A, can she finish and score well? Or B, if it does go to decision, does she have enough output, takedowns, control time to be able to pay off that salary? I'm not completely sure. That's going to be one thing that we dig into more on the DraftKings deep dive show on Thursday night. I'll link that in the description below. But Jasudavicius in this matchup, I just think it really suits her because she's going up against somebody in Priscilla Cachoeira who has basically no semblance of a ground game. She defends takedowns at just 65%, and once you get her down, it's basically the round because she has no idea how to work back to her feet. She has nothing off her back as far as submissions go, get up games. She's totally neutralized once you put her on her back. Now on the feet, she's very powerful. She's going to walk forward and try to land something big. I just think Jasmine is physical enough and a good enough wrestler that she's going to be able to peel her to the ground, and basically she's going to dominate her from there. I think the bigger question is just, again, whether or not you think she could finish. Obviously, she's fighting in front of her home crowd in Canada, so maybe with the crowd behind her, she really chases a finish. But ultimately, I think this one probably goes 15 minutes. I think Jasmine has a safe floor because of that multiple takedown and high control type of upside. But again, 9,500, it's just a tough salary to get to on DraftKings. We're going Jasudavicius by decision. That's the official pick. Next up in the welterweight division, we have Johan Lainesse, a minus 155 favorite. The comeback on Sam Patterson is plus 130. Now, Patterson is making his welterweight debut. He fought his whole career at 155, but he was very big for the division, very tall and lanky frame. He's got like this freakishly long frame, so it was no surprise that he would eventually be moving up to 170. Now, did he do that sooner, coming off a extremely brutal knockout at 155 in his UFC debut? Could be, but he's had a lot of time off, hopefully enough time to fill out that frame, add some muscle. He's still going to be very long for this division as well. And I just think the market is just too low on him in this type of matchup. Similar to the Jimmy Flick thing that I talked about in the first fight, I think this is a super, super buy low spot on a guy like Sam Patterson, who's facing somebody in Johan Lainez, who basically, I have a hard time getting to a chalk price tag against almost anybody on the roster. Like Johan Lainez, yes, he has power. Most of his wins career-wise have come by knockout. We know he's going to swing those big bombs early, but what does he not have? It's the cardio, the gas tank. This dude gasses in all of his fights after the first round. Every single time you see any fight that gets extended past the first round, he's gassed by like the 6.5, 7 minute mark, looking up at the clock, taking huge blows, and just getting sloppier as he's winging those big shots. I don't trust the gas tank. I don't trust the defensive grappling. We've seen him get submitted fairly easily, has no idea what to do when he gets taken down, kind of like I talked about with Cachoeira. And now he's facing somebody in Sam Patterson who is powerful enough on the feet. He's got nasty body kicks. Yes, his defense struggles. So I think Lainez is certainly capable of landing that big shot against Patterson, who's coming off such a brutal knockout. We know he's chinny. He doesn't play good defense, but Patterson's a good striker as well. And I trust Patterson to be able to at least push a pace longer than Lainez. And I also think Patterson is a sneaky good submission grappler. He's ended 4 fights by guillotine choke alone. He's got some nasty submissions in his arsenal. We saw that on Contender Series. Johan Lainez certainly has KO1 upside, but outside of that, man, I would not want to be anywhere near laying juice on this guy on the money line because I do not trust him outside of the first round. He better land a big shot early because if he doesn't, I honestly think Patterson takes over and probably submits him in rounds 2 or round 3. So if the field's not going to go to Patterson because everybody thinks that he sucks, he's moving up a weight class, blah, 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 whatever, I'm going to be overweight to Patterson just because I think he has a real bullish case to him that I don't think the field is going to recognize. So we're going to go with Patterson by submission. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Jillian Robertson, a -240 favorite. The comeback on Paulina Viana is +200. And this is one that I think is kind of a tailor-made matchup for Jillian Robertson because we know that she does not want to be stuck at space. She doesn't want to be on the feet. Her striking, while she's been working on it and it's coming along, it's still probably a net negative against most fighters in the division. She needs to get the fight to the ground. That's her world. She's an aggressive grappler, averages over 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and most of her career wins have come by submission. So we know she wants to get the fight to the ground. Fortunately for her, Paulina Viana is extremely willing to play off her back, to give up those takedowns. She defends takedowns around 50% in the UFC, and we've seen time and time again, she's just giving up the takedowns just to play jiu-jitsu off her back, which doesn't correlate to winning minutes at the UFC level. It correlates to maybe finding a submission, but that's most likely coming against people that don't know what they're doing, especially a fighter like Jillian Robertson, who's a very strong, safe positional grappler while she's in top position. I'd be very surprised if she got caught with something from Viana off her back. So I think this is almost like a walk in the park for Jillian Robertson here. She's very dangerous on top, not just hunting submissions, but also landing ground and pound as well. So this is one that I expect Robertson to get the style of fight that she wants and her to do well in that as well. So she's going to land multiple takedowns, and I think she probably gets a finish. We're going Robertson by submission. That's the official pick. Next fight up in the bantamweight division, we have Surrey City, a -180 favorite. The comeback on Ramon Tavares is +150. And this is one that I'm very familiar with both these guys. They fought on last season of Dana White's Contender Series. You guys know I do a bunch of Dana White Contender Series content right here on my channel. So you can watch the first time I broke down that fight for a Contender Series. I believe it was week 5. But really my analysis hasn't changed much based on what we saw in that first fight, because I think what we saw was Tavares starting to get the better of the boxing exchanges, which is kind of what I expected, because that's what he is, right? He's a very good boxer. He's very one-dimensional in that sense, but he fights out of southpaw stance, devastating leg kicks as well, very fast hands. And basically every time City threw one of those kicks, Tavares was punishing him, making him pay. The 1-2 down the middle would not miss. But then what happened? City caught him, put him down on his butt, and he was still coherent, started defending, had his legs up, and Mike McDonald comes in and just waves it off. for no reason. So nobody was happy with it. Dana White was appalled on Contender Series, so I'm glad they're rebooking the fight. They actually gave Tavares another Contender Series fight, and he won by first round knockout. But City is going to be fighting in front of his home crowd. He's a former BFL champion. That's the Canadian promotion. He won the bantamweight strap over there. His only professional loss came against Matthias Vogel, who also fought on Contender Series. He got submitted in that fight. But City is a guy who I think is pretty well-rounded, but he's just not great in any key area. Where I expect him to have advantages here is the well-roundedness of his game. I think he's the better grappler, even though he's not super aggressive in going for the takedowns, and I don't think he really will here either. But also I expect him to have the better durability, because that's the one knock on Tavares, is that he does seem to be a little chinny, not just because he got dropped in the first time these guys fought, but also previously on the regional scene was knocked out early. I don't know if I fully trust the chin, but I do trust the skill set. I think he's the better boxer here. I expect him to get the better of the striking exchanges. So if he can avoid getting clipped again, I think he's certainly a live dog, and one that I could see getting his hand raised on Saturday night. So we're going to go with Tavares, the underdog here, by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Charles Jourdain, a -190 favorite. The comeback on Sean Woodson is +145. And I'll be honest with you guys, this is probably the fight that I struggled with the most, watching tape, digging into the stats. I just kind of went back and forth. Like, I could see the case for both sides. And so for me, from a betting standpoint, that's a clear stay away. And then in terms of DraftKings, I could see this one kind of having, you know, multiple different outcomes here. And I think it's going to be one that I'm actually going to look to get away from, because I do think more than likely it does hit the judges' scorecards. Now, where I'd be afraid to just fade it completely is because they both generally fight at a pretty high pace. They're both high volume strikers. So if they just go out there and trade 150 significant strikes each, it's probably going to score pretty well. So I don't think you can X these guys out. But in terms of the matchup, Jourdain's a high volume striker, like I mentioned. He's got sneaky good submission grappling upside as well, even though he never looks for takedowns, and he can be taken down himself. He defends takedowns around 50%. He gives up takedowns basically for free. And that's one thing that we've seen Sean Woodson actually add as an element in his game. His last couple fights, he's gone to the takedowns more, trying to prove that he's not just a boxer, because we know he's got that very long frame. He's got a strong jab. He's smooth with his boxing combinations. So if he's able to incorporate some takedowns here, keep it competitive on the feet, that's where I think he has a real case here. But I also think Jourdain kind of loves that fighting style, and I'd be surprised if Woodson did go for the takedowns and get multiple takedowns here. So I kind of just think it's a striking fight where Jourdain might be able to land the bigger shots, has the Canadian crowd behind him. So I slightly edge Jourdain, but I do think that Woodson's a live underdog here. The official pick is going to be Jourdain by decision. But again, I'm probably not going to be planting my flag on either side for DraftKings. Next fight up, we have Brad Katana, a -192 favorite here. The comeback on Garrett Armfield is +160. And this is one where it kind of pains me to say, because I've never been a Katana guy, but I actually think this is a pretty safe matchup for him. Like, Katana, I've never been a huge fan because he hasn't been that exciting, particularly his first run in the UFC, which didn't go over that great. But now coming back, he kind of proved me wrong in that fight against Cody Gibson his last time out. That was the tough finale. He ended up winning that fight. Super high pace, went back and forth, went tooth and nail with Cody Gibson. Both guys landed some big shots there, and it was just at a ridiculous pace. One of the best fights I think I've seen in the last couple of years. So credit to Brad Katana, but I actually just think he's super well-rounded. Black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He has kind of that judo wrestling style, so he doesn't land a ton of takedowns, but he is capable of doing it. A lot of cage push. He's a very smart, high IQ fighter, and I just think the experience and the skill set is going to pay dividends here against a guy like Garrett Armfield, who's still relatively inexperienced. You know, he looked good in his last fight, but he fought, you know, one of the lower level guys in the UFC. I think it's a big step up for him here if he's unable to land a big shot early, which I'd be surprised because Katana's proven to be super durable. Outside of that, I don't really see a path to victory for Armfield here. I don't think he's going to be able to grapple with Katana. I don't think he's really going to be able to strike at space with Katana either. So I think Katana really has him covered basically every angle here. So even though the money line's getting a little steep here, I do think Katana gets his hand raised. We're going Katana by decision, that's the official pick. And before we get to the main card, guys, do me a favor, hit the like button and that subscribe button. I really appreciate it. It goes a long way in supporting my channel. Now back to the fights. And kicking off the main card, we have Movsar Evloev, a minus 192 favorite. The comeback on Arnold Allen is plus 160. And Evloev's a guy who I just think is so good, man. He's undefeated, 17-0. He lands takedowns, nearly 5 takedowns per 15 minutes, and he's got nasty cardio, that relentless pace. He's pushing the takedowns nonstop, not super great at controlling people. You know, he's been able to have fighters be able to work back to his feet, but that's fine for DraftKings because we want those mat return takedowns, rack up those takedowns and rack up that scoring. And you've seen his last few fights, like he's popping off in the 120s and 130s. So at 8,700, I do expect him to be one of the most popular fighters on the slate, and for good reason, because he has that type of upside. Now, on the flip side, he's facing Arnold Allen. That could be his toughest test to date. I would think it's his toughest test to date, but I also think that Arnold Allen, you know, he put on a crazy run in UFC, but a lot of that came against lower level of competition. And now that we've seen him go up against the better guys, he was kind of fortunate to have Calvin Kattar blow out his knee in that fight. And then he basically got, you know, humbled against Max Holloway, had a big bet on Max Holloway in that fight. So happy to have that one come through. But Arnold Allen's a guy who's very well-rounded, very technically sound. He's got power on the feet. He kind of reminds me of Leon Edwards in a sense. He's one of those guys that's just pretty good wherever the fight goes, but he also is not blowing you away in terms of his round winning minutes because he doesn't put a ton of pace on guys. He's not a high volume striker, and he doesn't really look to grapple all that much. He averages around 1 takedown per 15 minutes. So what's interesting in this fight is Arnold Allen's takedown defense statistically is pretty good, but he's fought basically almost nobody that's been looking to take him down lately. And when they did, it was like, you know, you have to go back to the Nick Lentz fight where he's like a gassed out 37-year-old or 36. So it wasn't really telling us that Arnold Allen has this great takedown defense. If you go back to his early UFC days, he was taken down multiple times. Obviously, he's gotten better since then, but I think that Movsar Evloev, one of the better grapplers in the division, I think he's going to be able to land multiple takedowns here, and I think that's going to be the difference. So we're going to go Evloev by decision. That's the official pick. And next up, we have Chris Curtis, a minus 198 favorite, and the comeback on Marc-Andre Barrera is plus 164. And this is one where, you know, I wanted to do it. I wanted to back Marc-Andre Barrera. He's made some money for me in the past. I just like his fighting style because he puts on exciting fights. He fights at a high pace. He wants to get in close, make it dirty, and land those big elbows in the clinch. He's just a fun fighter to watch, but he's also got his limitations as well. Because of that exciting fighting style, he's usually not fighting optimally, and he almost has to make it, you know, those dirty type of fights to be able to have upside in a lot of these matchups. And against a guy like Chris Curtis, I'm just not sure he's going to be able to have those big moments and be able to close that distance because Chris Curtis, you know, say what you want about him, the dude's a very good boxer. He's got strong defense. He's powerful on the feet. 17 of his 30 career wins have come by knockout, and he's just a very technical striker. So I think if Barrera can't close the distance and he gets stuck at space here, Chris Curtis can kind of make him look silly. And that's where I struggle because if Barrera does close distance and make this a dirty fight, I think he's super live. It's just that I struggle where if that doesn't happen, I kind of think he gets blown out to a degree. So I'm going to side with Chris Curtis here reluctantly. We're going Curtis by decision. That's the official pick. And next up on the pay-per-view card, we have Mike Malott, a minus 340 favorite. The comeback on Neil Magny is plus 270. And I just think this is a tailor-made matchup for Mike Malott here. He's a very explosive fighter. Pretty much all of his wins have come in the first round. I think he's had 1 or 2 in the second round, but he's a dangerous submission grappler, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's the striking coach in one of his camps. He's a local guy here, big Canadian guy, so we know he's going to want to put on a show for the home crowd, and I think he does because he's kind of just getting the perfect matchup for him to a degree. Not that Neil Magny isn't a solid test because he is, you know, an okay gatekeeper at this stage in his career, but he's getting older, and we've certainly seen the limitations in terms of the physicality and the athleticism at this stage in his career. But what worries me most about Neil Magny in matchups like this, the dude absolutely loves to stick his neck out there and get submitted. He's been submitted more times than I can count. And now he's facing a guy that loves to snatch up your neck. I just think these guys at some point early are going to end up tangling up and grappling. And I just really favor Mike Malott in that spot. And I even think Malott can clip Magny on the feet potentially as well. So Malott, I think, has multiple ways to win here. And I think they both come inside the distance. So we're going Mike Malott by submission. That's the official pick. Next up, the first of two title fights. This one's in the women's bantamweight division, as Mayra Bueno Silva is a minus 166 favorite. The comeback on Raquel Pennington is plus 140. And I got to be honest, I'm not really all that excited to watch this fight. I mean, I think Bueno Silva is exciting. I think Pennington is kind of like that Holly Holm nature where it's really just, it usually doesn't lead to exciting fights. That doesn't mean that it can't, but just in general, she's one of the least exciting fighters that I could think of on this card. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. That being said, I do think this is one where I'm kind of torn on whether or not I think you want DraftKings exposure to it, because I could see a world where Bueno Silva finishes early, and obviously in that sense you would want her. I could see a world where Pennington just puts up enough volume over 5 rounds, maybe even gets a super late stoppage or something if Bueno Silva gasses, and in that sense she would probably end up being on the optimal lineup. But I could also see scenarios where they both just kind of don't get there, right? Like they don't really fight at a super high pace. We could see a lot of cage push, stalling in this fight as well. So even though it's 5 rounds, I think there's at least some outcomes where it doesn't end up optimal. Now, it's not as hard of a conviction stance as I had on last week's main event not being optimal, but I think it is, you know, potentially an edge to fade it depending on how the ownership shakes out. I'll do ownership projections later in the week, and I'll be sure to cover this more in depth on the strategy DraftKings deep dive show for subscribers on FightNumbers.com, as always on Thursday nights. But in terms of the matchup, Bueno Silva is certainly the better submission grappler. I think she's got basically almost all of the finishing upside in this fight, but I also worry about the cardio because she's been gassed even in 3-round fights at times. And if this fight hits those championship rounds, Raquel Pennington's been there before. We know that she could at least somewhat keep that pace over 25 minutes if needed. So that's the one concern with seeing Bueno Silva as a favorite here. But I do just think, you know, she's the better grappler. I think she's making improvements. You know, she's 4-0 since returning to the bantamweight division since her Contender Series fight a few years back. So I'm going to side with her. She's a more exciting fighter. I like her more, so I'm cheering for her more. So that's definitely part of it as well. But we are going to go with her. And like I said, I'll probably have to dig into this one a little bit more before the DraftKings show on Thursday. But we're going to go with Bueno Silva by submission. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our main event for the middleweight strap, as Sean Strickland comes in as a minus 130 favorite. The comeback on Dricus Du Plessis is plus 110. And this is one where I've seen a ton of love on the Du Plessis side, and I get it. Like, I'm a huge fan of this dude. I was rooting for him, you know, against Robert Whittaker as a huge underdog there. Crazy stoppage that he was able to come through as a big underdog there. And I just think that the type of fighter that Du Plessis is, he could only ever be so big of an underdog to where it's not value, because he's almost always going to bring it night in and night out. He's very, very powerful, super aggressive, and you see it. Like, that's why he was kind of like a meme coming into the UFC, because he has like that Francis Ngannou, close your eyes and just swing, you know, from the hip, like crazy, crazy style. But it's been effective. He's landing these big shots, and he's certainly got power. He's also got an underrated ground game as well. We've seen him show that off in a couple of fights. His grappling's not bad, so he's pretty well-rounded. But I do worry about the cardio. Yes, he's been able to fight through it at times in 3-round fights. He's been able to keep up that volume even when he looks super, super gassed and he's sucking for air. That Brad Tavares fight comes to mind where he looked visibly gassed, where he could barely even stand and he's sucking air, but he's still throwing volume. You love to see that. But I also think against a guy like Sean Strickland, who we know is going to keep that pace up for 25 minutes, if this fight gets to the championship rounds, I think you have to favor Sean Strickland in rounds 4 and 5, and maybe even before that as well. So that's why I'm leaning towards Sean Strickland here. I trust his durability a little bit more. I certainly trust his cardio more, and I just expect him to be able to keep that pace up for 25 45 minutes. He's got solid defense, and I'm just not convinced that Duplessis' style, where he's just darting into the pocket, throwing 4, 5, 6 punch combinations, is going to work against that shell defense that Sean Strickland uses. So I'd be surprised if Duplessis pulls it off here. I know a lot of people are backing him here as an underdog. I'm going to be on the other side. I like Sean Strickland to keep the belt here. And still, we're going Sean Strickland by TKO. That's the official pick. And as always, guys, FightNumbers.com will have my ownership projections. It'll have fantasy points per minute and the new home of FightPickSim, the advanced DraftKings projection simulation and optimization tool based on your picks. So definitely check that out. Let me know what you guys think. Best of luck, and we'll see you guys next week.